Okay, we're all set.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeannie. Welcome, everybody. For those of you I don't know, my name is Bridget Kessner. I am with the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. I will be facilitating our meeting. So this is the Council on Sexual Misconduct Climate Assessments meeting. This is our second, taking place on Tuesday, December 14th, 2021 at 12 p.m. here on Zoom. I thank you all so much for your attendance today. Before we get started, I know we ran through introductions in our last meeting, so I just wanted to see if we did have any new members who were not present at our meeting 2 weeks ago who wanted to introduce themselves. Anybody new like to introduce themselves?
I can go.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amber Stevenson. I'm currently an MSW student at Quinnipiac University in the North Haven campus, and I am one of the student reps for Every Voice Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Amber, and welcome. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Leticia Reed. I'm the Associate Vice President for the Office of Institutional Equity at Uconn. I began in August, and this role I also serve as the university's Title IX coordinator.
Great, thank you so much for being here and for your introduction. Those are the only new names that I believe that I'm seeing on screen. With that, I know that we have, though it may look short, a rather packed agenda. Just to preface today's meeting, I'm really hoping that we can take some time to essentially formulate a strategy moving forward. I think that would be our best bet, is to essentially create a bit of a roadmap for how we would like to go about the tasks that are at hand. There are some powers and duties of the council that were defined in statute that we did discuss in our last meeting, and that I did provide for your reference in the documents that I had sent out following that meeting. So I'm hoping that we can start to really define some specific objectives based on those powers and duties. I'm hoping that we can really start to develop a timeframe for those objectives so that we can get an idea as to how long this task is essentially going to take, and ensure that we stay productive, right, and moving toward a deadline. And then I would like to establish what our next steps look like. So when are we going to meet next? And in the time between this meeting and next, what are we seeking to accomplish based on those objectives? I think essentially getting organized and having a roadmap will really help us to move forward in a way that is most productive. So I'm definitely eager to formulate the strategy with all of you. And with that, I wanted to start by handing it over to Lily, who did reach out to me between this meeting and our last. And given her expertise in this field, really has some exciting ideas as to how we can get started, get organized. And so with that, I would like to hand it over to you, Lily. But after you share, if anybody else would like to jump in with any thoughts, feel free as well.
Thanks, Bridget. It's great to see everyone today. So as Bridget mentioned, I reached out because I was sort of trying to wrap my mind around our charge, and especially around the timeline. This seems really hard to kind of figure out what we all could produce that would be of a high enough quality to be really useful for schools in Connecticut kind of on this timeline. And so the idea that I kind of sent over the transom for Bridget that I wanted to test out with you all was that maybe it would be useful for us to look at our charge in the legislation and see if there are places where we might actually be able to kind of scale what our group produces to be much tighter then kind of the potentially expansive set of documents that, that I could imagine, like if we had much more time, we might all generate quite a bit more content. But it seems like, especially with the resources that folks contributed and that are gathered in the Google folder, like there's a lot of really good work that we could leverage, and then maybe as part of our charge, do some, really helpful condensing or, sort of creating things that maybe are a little bit more lightweight, but that help other colleges make use of the resources that are out there. So thinking about kind of how to scale what we produce in a way that would fit kind of our timeline was something that I thought we might consider. And then the other idea that I had was one of sort of staging. So even if we really trim down kind of what it is that we're really producing, it feels like there would still be a need for some degree of sort of producing whatever deliverables we're coming up with in a little bit of a phased approach. So what I heard at our last meeting was certainly the need for us to try as hard as we can to have a significant amount of our work completed by January 1, but that there are also these practical timelines in play of when the legislature comes back in session and the committee wants to, have something more tangible that they could discuss and review. And then also, as written in our charge, when colleges and universities in Connecticut would need to have completed their work along the lines of this legislation. So we have these kind of more practical timelines that we want to really help achieve that feel like they're different from saying fully pencils down January 1st was kind of what I was hearing. So maybe in addition to thinking about where we could kind of rein in the scope of what we're doing, if we could think about sort of taking our work in a little bit of a stepwise fashion so that there are sort of deliverables that come online as we go along, and that we can also kind of refer to as we then do the next steps of our work. So that was how I was thinking through our charge at this point. I don't know if other folks had ideas about how to do this amount of work in the very narrow span of time that we have.
Thank you, Lily. I think I definitely had some thoughts preceding our conversation and following it. Considering our time frame, I think I want to really look at the legislation and consider that it is a bit prescriptive, right, in what we are asking institutions to measure. It does list what we want, to be asked to an extent, not quite how it's going to be asked, but right, we want these measurements of what students' experiences are, what their perceptions are, and all of that is really laid out in the legislation. So something that I think would be a great place for our focus and to spend some attention on would be tips for implementation, right? That's one of the charges of this group. And I think it would be a place that we would really have the ability to make a significant impact to the way that this is carried out. I also reviewed the tools that were provided with the consideration of these questions that are essentially already to some extent placed in statute, right? So when we're asking, for instance, about students' experiences of victimization, I definitely found it helpful to really zero in on the questions from the surveys you all provided that spoke to that. Really kind of comparing the language and seeing how we could potentially provide some guidance to institutions, but also, of course, allowing them to have flexibility in how these questions are asked, because that's definitely critical as we move forward. So I would definitely be interested to hear our thoughts moving forward about the sort of guidance that we could potentially provide, as well as how we can include that as a step in this timeline. I see Allie has her hand up.
Yeah, I think a good first step would to just be reviewing the legislation altogether. And then I also understand the time constraint, but I think if we're operating from the only limit being time, we could think about other ways that we might asynchronously do the work and then maximize our time together at the next meeting. So something that the Massachusetts Council does, which is doing the work right now, is the data points that we've been tasked to do thus far have been split among people on the council per their preferences. They go on like a doc asynchronously, or they meet asynchronously, which I know could be a limit because we're right near the holidays. And they come up with what exactly that would look like in guidance and recommendation. And then we have a meeting this Friday. We're all going to come back with those recommendation ideas. I would just be wary about being as scaled back as we can as time allows, because I think, especially from the student perspective, I don't think a lot of students are in the room when their institutions are creating the surveys, and this is an opportunity to make sure that some of those perspectives are centered, and they might not otherwise be. So I don't really know the logistics. I might just be talking really broadly, and that's annoying, but that's my thought.
Not annoying at all, Allie. I definitely appreciate your perspective on behalf of students, because that's so critical to think about as we're moving forward. I definitely did consider as well what the benefit could be of essentially working groups, right, surrounding some of these tasks. So I think as we start to divide out these tasks, if folks want to identify what they think could best be accomplished through, say, a working group that can communicate between our larger council meetings, I think that that would definitely be helpful, provided we are able to loop one another in when we reconvene. But I'm interested to hear any other thoughts that folks might have. All right. I'm not seeing any hands up. I think I appreciate, Lily, what you shared about, talking about a phased approach. And I think that that aligns well with sort of the idea that I had for today's meeting to talk through what these tasks could look like. And I think as we start to discuss these tasks, we can, to an extent, address the scope, right? So I think thinking about this, thinking about these objectives that we've discussed on a timeline would definitely be helpful. I agree that I want everyone to be on the same base with the legislation. I did, we did skim through that together at our last meeting, and it was provided in the Google doc that I had sent over to everyone. So it is available for review on our council's page. And I definitely recommend that you take some time to sift through that, but I don't necessarily want to pull it up on screen unless there's a consensus that would be particularly helpful at this time. I saw Hillary, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I didn't know if it would be helpful just looking at page 6, which has the required data. I mean, but I don't want to do that if others don't need to look at it. And then also it's page 9 that has, that deadline with the 2 things. And I was thinking, would it be helpful to really think about on those things that are in the legislation itself, work from those? Because it's pretty clear. I mean, especially the points that we do need to consider from page 6. And I didn't know if those would be areas where it would make sense, as you suggest. I liked Ali's suggestion about kind of the working groups on those, and then also coming to some consensus about what the recommended climate assessments would be. Seemed like it might be another area.
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely pull up specifically the text in statute regarding our council. So I will Share my screen with everybody. All right, so everybody can see here the statute.
Yes.
Great. So,
could you make it a little bit larger? Perfecto. Thank you.
there we go. All right. So this specifically lists out the powers and duties of the council, right? Starting with listing the data points to be collected by institutions. And as I was talking about, those are kind of the 3 significant points that institutions need to measure, right? So that was when I was talking about the points that I was comparing against the tools. That was what that was in reference to. And then we have the task of recommending the assessments. And then recommending guidelines for implementation with the considerations listed.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kara.
Thanks. Sorry. I was just going to say, it sounds like if we're going to break up into working groups, if that sounds like the direction we're heading in, it sounds like there would be a group, particularly I'm looking at 2A, or no, sorry, I'm sorry, 3A of achieving high rate of response. I feel from experience of even not necessarily climate surveys, but surveys in general, reaching numbers of students. And I'd love to hear, feedback from the rest of the council too, and even just a guidance on response rate, because I think that's a barrier that I've seen at WestConn particularly, but I'm sure other schools as well. So if we are going to be breaking up into working groups, it sounds like that may be one group in and of itself, and then other groups focusing on the data points, more listed in 1A through C.
I definitely appreciate that. Did anybody else want to jump in with any thoughts?
Yeah, I actually wanted to share that I found it helpful to take this section of legislation and copy it into a Word document and just kind of bring a little bit of, I don't know, nesting to it. And that helped me actually think about how a couple of working groups might also be organized. So I don't know if it would be helpful for me to put that on screen, but I could do that if you want, or I could just send that to you, Bridget.
Can you put it on screen? I think the same way, Lily. I need to see it broken down. It's like big paragraph. It's not helpful for me.
I'll stop my share and.
Well, okay. Let's see. So can everyone see my Word document?
Yes.
Okay. So I've taken just that same set of text and literally copied and pasted it. So the section that feels like it's the meat of our charge is super bullets 1, 2, and 3. And then down later is our assignment list of data points, sort of recommended assessments and guidelines. So the sort of shorthand version, it feels like, of what 1, 2, and 3 are. So in line with what Kara was recommending, I was starting to look at this and feeling like maybe 2 working groups would make sense. So it felt to me like grouping super bullet 1 and 2 might hang together well, because that is really kind of the nexus of digging through what instruments exist and really reading that language, looking at the topics that those instruments cover, which is related to, but I feel like meaningfully different from what you could be doing throughout this Super Bullet 3, which is referencing those materials, but there's a whole separate set of materials out there, and also, just a wealth of experience in this group that could really inform some helpful guidance about how to do these assessments and how to do them well, how to keep response rates in mind, how to keep your community values in mind, and so on. So it feels like a different topic. So I'm happy to keep this up, but I can also, Bridget, send this to you and put it into the box folder, and that way just everyone would have kind of flexible access to it, if that makes sense. What would be most helpful?
Yeah, definitely feel free to put it in the drive you should have access to. Okay. To do so. I think that that's definitely helpful. And actually, this is definitely the same way I've considered framing working groups as well. I think that those two first tasks pair nicely, and then moving on to the third. With all of that being said, I see Allie's hand is up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I, really appreciate the layout of this too, and that I also appreciate the structure. And I think putting 1 and 2 makes sense together, because within the recommendations of data points, just more broadly too, we might take things from what we consider model surveys and just, we have the data points, we have what we think institutions should cover, and then of course they should specify maybe to the point of their institution. But I think it kind of goes hand in hand, and I think the working groups will make this all more tangible and probably a bit quicker. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Allie. Any other feedback? Yes, Hillary, I see your hand up.
I just have a question, and it relates to something that came up in the last meeting, and it's not directly drafted in the charge, but I think it's something that we talked about last time that may fall into that second group, if we're going to break up into 2 groups. And that's also how institutions, I thought part of what the council was supposed to do is also offer some guidance to institutions, how, now that you have these data, what do you do with them, and how do you better support our students? And so I was thinking that even with that part where it talks about the implementation, it's also the guidance of how to, the best practices around using those data, and how those data are, they can enliven possibilities for our students. And so I just didn't know if that would be maybe even like a third group, or I just think that's so important, even though it's not directly detailed in our charge.
Absolutely agreed. And I think it is associated with the third, but I definitely think it deserves to be stated outright, as you said. Lily, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment, Hillary. I think so often discussions about running a survey can kind of obscure, the point of why we do these things, which is to actually use the data and improve our culture. And that's an amount of work that is daunting and requires its own, time and expertise and practice. And I think it's definitely an important part of that kind of second working group's mission, is to kind of really highlight that's why these surveys and other kinds of assessments would be run, and that has to be sort of kept in mind when you're figuring out kind of all the other methods around what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and when you're going to do it.
Absolutely. Anybody else have any feedback? All right. So I guess the next question would be, if the best way to work through these tasks is to develop these working groups. would those groups be essentially operating at the same time, or would one group? Yes. Okay. And what timeline would folks be looking at? Kara?
Bridget, sorry. I'm
Although
sorry.
I saw Stacy was going to say, go ahead, Stacy.
We have some folks missing, but I just added up the group minus Jeannie. There's 14 of us now. How many other people are missing? I know Debbie's missing today. No, she is there. Sorry. She's just off screen. But I mean, if we're 14, we could do 7 and 7 if we broke up into 2 teams or groups. But is anyone else missing?
Louisa
one
is not
student.
here and Stephanie's not here,
So that would take us.
along with some legislators.
Okay, so that would take us to 16 minus the legislators. So we could do 8 and 8, or I don't know if we'd become an odd number or not, but okay.
I would also be willing to see what which group, based on their personal expertise, individuals would be interested in.
Yeah, I was just thinking about
joining.
the breakdown of the numbers, not necessarily who was in the group. So,
Kara?
I was just going to say, going off of Allie's point before, I think having like a working, we have our Google form or Google Doc that we all, or folder that we all have access to. If we're going to be working simultaneously but separately, I think it would be really helpful to have access to both of those, obviously, to see, so that we can inform one another, even if we're not meeting with the other working group too. So.
Absolutely. I agree. Any other feedback on the working groups? Lily?
Yeah, I think I know that not everyone would be able to participate in both groups, also just for the sake of time. But if it's possible to ensure that the groups meet asynchronously from each other, so that all members of the council can participate in one or both, I think that would be really beneficial.
So based on each of your individual, I know we're also coming up on a time period where we have a lot of time off potentially, or some folks have a good amount of downtime. I want to be considering that, as well as the fact that we are coming up against the deadline in statute. We are coming up against the upcoming legislative session. So with all of that in mind, what time frame do folks think would be an appropriate amount to have these working groups be developing at least the beginning of these materials? Allie?
I mean, I'm like on break, so I don't like have a job and stuff, but I think if we could work it out where there's enough time for us to reconvene and just review and talk about people's works from the working groups and answer any questions and troubleshoot anything, I think that would be ideal. So I don't know when people are off, and it's definitely contingent on that, but I would prioritize having that time to reconvene and come together if possible.
I'd like to jump in and just say, I don't think I'm not going to be able to do anything until after the new year. So starting January 3rd. And then even after the new year, I actually have all these Title IX trainings and refreshers planned. I have a lot of work to do to get folks up to speed here at CCSU in terms of the new regs, which I found out are going to change again, which folks probably already know. But it's gonna happen probably sooner than later. But in any case, January is going to be like a really tight month in general because of MLK Day and things that are coming out of my office in terms of trainings. So whatever we choose, I just want to get it on the books now so that I can work around it. But anything after the 3rd is fine for me, as long as we can find a time that works for everybody's schedules.
Sure. Hillary?
Were we looking at February 1st is that what we were still using as the deadline? Because that had been mentioned that they're starting back up February 1st. Even though the legislation says January 1st, we're looking at February 1st. I'm just trying to understand when it is that we're aiming for this set of recommendations in the.
Right, and that's essentially what I'm asking, what I'm hoping to kind of gather from everyone, if that is a reasonable deadline for at the very least these groups to collaborate on some work together, and then for our council to reconvene and discuss before that time.
I think that works for me. I like Stacy, I will be unable to do anything until after the new year, but come January, I think February 1st would be a reasonable time frame for myself at least.
Okay, thanks, Kara. So I think that is a good plan for the time being. And I want to move forward with planning that a bit more, designating, who wants to be involved in which working group. I can, of course, reach out to those folks who are not here today to catch them up to speed and ensure they have a chance to kind of join the space that they feel would be best. However, I do also want to acknowledge the January 1st date, and I wanted to reach out to folks and see, I had a couple of potential ideas of my own, but I wanted to see what everyone's thoughts were as to what we could potentially produce for January 1st. Were there any thoughts in regards to that?
Can you clarify, Bridget, what you mean? Like, are you asking if there's anything we can actually have, like a product before January 1st?
So for instance, my thought, and again, feel free, based on everyone's expertise and also, your time and capacity to contribute, given, again, the season we're in, right? My consideration is that we could potentially put out, at the very least, some sort of document just providing an update as to where the council is, what our plan is moving forward, and what those objectives are. Kristen?
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like by January 1st, especially with all of the wonderful examples we had, I feel like we could probably at least settle on the data points, even if we don't have the specific questions laid out. Like, we know these are the areas within the survey we're going to be focusing on. Kind of like a real loose skeleton, I think would be achievable.
Lily?
Kind of as a variation on that, I was wondering what the group would think of an approach for January 1, which is to take the enabling legislation, which in that section 1A, B, C, like already lays out some, as Bridget was saying, a pretty prescriptive view of like, here are the kind of headings that assessments need to contain. So we have that, we have our working plan of, we're gonna have these two groups. And then we also have a folder which now has quite a bit of content gathered into it that includes instrumentation and guidance that to me starts to feel like a substantive kind of first chapter of what this group has produced. So I guess, would it make sense for the January 1 time point to be a very brief sort of overview of what the group has discussed, and then almost just an initial repackaging of those documents that are currently in our folder already, sort of saying, within the realm of identifying instruments that include the necessary topics. We've identified the following ones. They're available for any college to use already. Within the realm of providing guidance, we've identified the following short list of very useful sort of reference documents. And already, if like these can be distributed more widely, but in the new year and for a February 1 deadline, the council is going to reconvene and focus in more depth on condensing what we've learned from those two bodies of material. Like, is that substantive enough for a January 1?
Yeah, and that was essentially my hope in terms of what we could provide update to. But I appreciate the idea of including the documents in the folder as sort of examples of what we're reviewing. Allie?
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's transparent to where we're at too. I would say like in terms of like the data points, we wouldn't want to overextend our work because we haven't gotten to the point where even like I can say that I've delved into models and questions. So I think if we do include anything, making sure that we're not locked in, and we mentioned that it's apt to change. And this might be a terrible idea, but I also wonder if the sort of limbo period between that January 1st release of what we have and when we reconvene and meet in our working groups, we can also solicit like any community feedback or ideas more like, I don't know, I know that this is an option, like an outlet for them to do it anyway, but like we have in the legislation a list of like 3 data points that are non-inclusive, like they're non-exhaustive. So like if a school has another data point in mind to let us know, like there could be a period to get that input and have it with us when we start working more tangibly in the groups.
Any thoughts to that, Hillary?
Yeah, that was going to be my question is because I like that idea of just kind of giving that draft of where we're at, or as you know, Lily said, chapter 1. But then is everything that people want in that folder for now, I mean, from what we're working from, is it sufficient? That was going to be my one question in terms of, I mean, there are some good instruments in there, but it's not exhaustive. And so that's why I was just wondering if, I think this, to Allie's point too, there might be things that we can still add prior to that January 1 deadline. It might be all you, I mean, again, a lot of it is, there's repeat questions and repeat, topics, but it still might be helpful to add a few. And also for people to be able to say specifically things that have been incorporated into the surveys that are there, but when you pull them out, like for instance, using the sexual experiences survey questions, sometimes people, it's really helpful to just see those when they're not pulled into an instrument, or even for the Illinois, rape myths, like even just looking at those questions before they're pulled into an instrument, those things might be useful too. I don't know. So I agree with Allie. I think maybe getting a little bit more input, just so people can kind of see what the standards are out there.
Sure. Lily?
I was wondering if it would be useful in our kind of January timelines to have folks within the council, or even if there are maybe other schools in Connecticut who aren't part of the council, to sort of invite almost like case studies of how a particular school has run an assessment, the instrument they used, the overview of kind of how they ran it, what they learned about how to run that kind of assessment, and kind of how they thought through it as a way to start to get to some of these other more granular points that we would probably want to include in some guidance about how to run this kind of project and what to be thinking about.
I definitely think that would be a helpful tool to be able to refer to. Do folks feel as if they would have the capacity to potentially provide those examples in the time frame?
Or it could be sort of something like a live discussion component of the further meetings.
Yeah, I think it would definitely be a helpful tool. So we can definitely dig into that. Kara, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going off of what everyone was saying, and Allie's suggestion of kind of getting community feedback. So I sit on the CART at WCSU, the Campus Response Resource Team, and we're actually meeting later today. Would it be helpful to pose it to CART to get any initial feedback on, informing this council's next meeting as we discuss the data points and everything?
I think that could be a good space to solicit input. Sure. I think based on each of your individual environments that you're kind of coming to us from, any way that you can sort of solicit feedback could definitely be helpful. And I think that would definitely be a good resource based on your position.
And were those, sorry if I misunderstood, are the documents in our Google folder also available to the public, or right now they're just internal, and then January 1 we will make that guidance or more kind of outlined available to the public?
Yeah, so it's not that they're necessarily unavailable, if anyone were to request access, but I think we'll be putting out that information more publicly, right? Okay. At that time, when we have the report. But if, I think, and anyone can, feel free to weigh in if you feel differently, but I think speaking to specific examples of different tools that might be in that folder could be helpful in discussions that others are having with the institutions that they're with. So I encourage you all to be, entirely transparent with, the information that is provided.
Thank you.
So were there any other thoughts in regards to what we want to report for January 1st? I definitely have no problem drafting that based on my facilitation of these meetings. However, based on all of your input, it would be, of course, helpful to have input from those who do have some capacity to provide it between now and January 1st. So personally, I will be working for the rest of this week and then following the Christmas holiday. So I'll be actively working then. However, I'll be available here and there to incorporate input that others may want to provide. So in addition to all the input that you've provided through these meetings, and of course through the resource folder as well, if there's anything else you'd like to put in there for the to be included in that report, definitely feel free to do so. And then the document will be available in that folder as well for your review before it's completed for January 1st. So that being said, I want to ensure that we really lay out the membership and goals of each of these working groups. So I definitely agree that separating it out with those first two tasks being the data points and tools, and then the second working group to address the implementation plan would really be the best way to kind of go about this. And it seems as if other folks agreed with that plan that Lily had kind of provided. So that being said, I would be interested to hear, based on your positions and your capacity to contribute, who might be interested in being involved in that first working group to address the data points and individual tools. Kristen? I see Lisa, Lily, Allie, Hillary, Amber, Colleen, Letisa, Kara, Stacy. Anybody else? Edith?
Bridget, I can serve on either group if there's too many on this one.
Well, I also want to provide, I don't necessarily want to be too restrictive in group membership. I think, if individuals feel as if they have the time to provide input on both of these working groups, I don't want to restrict that. And then, but I also don't want to apply that pressure for those who don't have that time or necessarily feel as if that, they would prefer to kind of focus their efforts on one or the other. But I don't think we necessarily need to, be too restrictive in regards to membership, but others can feel free to jump in if you feel differently. So for a second working group for the implementation plan for institutions, or essentially implementation guidelines, does anybody want to serve on that working group? Again, recognizing that folks can serve on both. See, Colleen. I see Lily. I see Hillary. Anybody else? This is also a space that I feel as if my background in victim service work definitely is a space I feel as if I can give a lot of input. So I'm definitely, as much as I will be involved in both, in terms of organizing, I'm definitely eager to provide input in regards to implementation. So of course, this is something that's flexible. So if you do want to at some point be included on something else, or feel as if you're overloaded and want to step back, please feel free to let me know. Unless there is sort of another idea to organize this, my plan was to essentially create 2 email threads to just sort of connect everybody in that way, and then have 2 separate folders for each working group, so that everybody can sort of, any documents that they might have, they can place there. Was there any other further organization that would be helpful for folks? Colleen, I see your hand. No, accident.
Sorry, I did that by accident.
No worries. But would that be a helpful way to begin to organize? Coordinate? Okay. Sounds good to me.
I think Sarah has her hand up.
Oh, Sarah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So sorry, I was dealing with an upset stomach, but can I join like the earlier group, like the data points group?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's what I want. Thank you very much.
No problem. So I will also reach out to those who were unable to meet us today, just to kind of fill them in and see where they would like to fit in all of this. And then I can put out emails to everybody and encourage you to start communicating within that doc and sharing any documents that you might have. I know when it comes to implementation, there's already some guidance documents that are out there that may be of a lot of help. And then I'm eager to see what the discussion is in regards to tools and the data points. Kara?
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking so much.
No,
One thought, just because I'm a visual person and it was helpful to see everything outlined too. If in the Google form or folder for the data points working group, if it would be helpful and feedback from the rest of the council too, to have documents outlined for feedback for each of the resources provided. So I know there was like one from Yale, Brandeis, CCSU. There were, at least I think 4 institutions or resources provided, so that we could each provide feedback on that specific one in its own doc. I think that would be really helpful for me, but would love to hear feedback from other members too.
Anybody? Seeing some nods. I think that's definitely would be a helpful way to organize it. I think as well in each folder, I can provide in statute what those tasks are, so that you have that document to work off as well in defining your objectives. Allie?
I was also wondering if before we conclude, we should look at the calendar for the next meeting date, either a little before or a little after February 1st, just so we we have that on the calendar too.
Definitely. This meeting was scheduled until 2:00. I know other folks may need to jump off, so I did plan to schedule something before we conclude today. But around the time frame you're talking about was the plan, to ensure that we can, we have a little bit of time before the February 1st deadline. In terms of getting organized and ensuring that we're addressing each of the objectives, does anybody have any other feedback as to what would be helpful moving forward? All right, so I think
Hillary has her hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Hillary. Oh, you're
my
muted.
only question, my only question involved for the institutions and colleges that don't have someone on this council, what would be, because I'm not here representing Quinnipiac, but I'm here and I work at Quinnipiac, so I can say what they think. So I'm just wondering for the colleges and institutions that don't have someone here, what's our interface with them? So for instance, it's kind of Debbie, the responsible for communicating, since she's representing the independent colleges. I just want to make sure that, we're in conversation with all of our institutions so that whatever it is that we're doing will have a home where it lands versus it being something that just comes as a surprise or people aren't involved in the conversation.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that. Is anybody who is in one of those broader roles want to speak to that role? Sort of overarching over multiple institutions in that respect. Colleen?
So I know I'm representing all of the community colleges. So that's sort of a broader role. And I know that Stacy from CCSU is representing the state universities, the 4 state universities. But so that's sort of some of the public. And I know Uconn's here. But in terms of the private side, I can't speak for them, but that's who we're here representing those. So we'll be communicating with our schools that we represent.
Great, thank you for speaking to that. In addition, I, within my role here at the Alliance, I do work with institutions statewide. So every institution I am a resource for and have established some contact with. So therefore, I definitely would be someone that folks could reach out to if they have any questions or are seeking more information. And additionally, I would be glad to sort of open discussion as well as to how we can ensure we preface this information well. So like you said, Hillary, it doesn't sort of come as a surprise. Well, I know that this legislation is on, on everyone's radar. As Stacey had mentioned earlier, there's so much going on with Title IX, and there's plenty of other legislation and other things going on with the pandemic. And I want to ensure that, again, this doesn't come as a surprise to folks. So if we want to create some sort of plan for how we want to ensure that they're informed in the loop, I would be happy to coordinate those efforts essentially based on my role in having the statewide reach. Lily?
Would it make sense to plan on taking whatever we produce for January 1st and sharing that more broadly and soliciting feedback on that and on our intended process at that point?
That was sort of my idea as well. So and I'm seeing some nods, so I think that unless anybody has an objection, I think that would be the easiest way to do it rather than attempting to create something additionally. And then of course, I'd be happy to include myself as a contact for people at the end of that form if there are any questions or concerns that they'd like to address, that I'm someone that they can reach out to. Any other thoughts or input? All right. So We are currently at an hour. We do have 2 scheduled. While we did address what I was hoping to in our, formulating our strategy today, and I do want to set a date, time, and kind of the tasks due before our next meeting. I do want to open it up for more discussion if there were any outstanding questions or concerns that anybody had on the council that they wanted to bring up.
I just had one quick question clarifying in the legislature that states when the universities and schools must distribute. So I was just referring back. So it says not later than 6 months after the distribution of the sexual misconduct climate assessment pursuant to subsection A, et cetera, and then every 2 years. So does that mean 6 months from that January 1 date when we release that initial guidance? Or would it be after our February 1 date of what we more, consolidated? Or is that open for interpretation kind of?
Yeah, I'll look into the language and ask folks to ensure that we're keeping to that. But that's a good question. So thanks for bringing that up. Lily?
I think it's off of the March 1 of 23 date. So as far as like what colleges and universities would need to produce by when is sort of, you have to have the first one administered in the field by March 1 of in 2023, and then get the results out and kind of keep rolling from there is how I read it.
I see that now. Thank you.
Is there anything else folks would like to address? Stacey, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm trying to decide if I want to ask this question because it's kind of like big and hairy. My question is about, is there any wiggle room at this point, or is there any discussion around the 2-year versus a more extended cycle for distributing the survey? And I asked that question in the context of the document, one of the documents in the Google Drive. I think it's the one moving toward a data ecosystem to assess campus responses to sexual assault and misconduct. And one of the pieces of information in there says rationale for a 4-year cycle. And I'm just wondering if that's still up for debate, or if is that a done deal at this point?
I'd be happy to address it because this is definitely something that came up a lot when we were in the process of getting this legislation together. So this council will convene and, put out some content every 2 years. However, we wanted to ensure that there was a lot of flexibility in sort of what we're tasked with and what needs to be distributed to ensure that if we wanted to say do something more extensive, right, once every 4 years, but then have some sort of evaluation done 2 years after that, or something smaller scale, right, that there would be that would be put in place, because that was really critically important to the folks that were providing input from their institutions, right, the students, survivors, and student activists that were really responsible for a lot of the legislation, right, and really had a strong voice in that. So we wanted to ensure that it was sort of balanced in that respect, that need was met, that they would have an opportunity to have input once every 2 years. However, we also understand that this may need to look different in that sort of after 2 years, right? If anybody wanted to speak to that further, I know, Lily, that was the resource that you had provided, but I know that this is something that a couple of you have expertise in. So if you'd like to provide further, information, that would be great. But just as a general overview, that is in part why we have some flexibility in what we're tasked with, is to ensure that, we're not prescribing such an extensive, survey be conducted once every 2 years. Yes, Lily.
Yeah, so That towards a data ecosystem document was one that I wrote a few years ago with some colleagues, and we were most focused on the specific kind of survey, which is the very, very lengthy, closed-ended survey that includes kind of all of the topics that you might want to asked all at once in depth. It takes quite a long time for a student to respond to that survey. So it's quite costly from a student perspective. It takes the longest to analyze kind of on the administrative side. It takes the longest to use really to its fullest power to make sense of all of that cost. And so my institutional research colleagues and I were trying to think through what is the timeline that seems like it would make sense for running that breadth and weight of instrument compared to the wealth of other kinds of assessments that exist. And where that kind of mega survey really is the most impactful when it's run maybe a little bit less frequently. So that's where we were thinking of every 4 years, but alongside and interspersed with other kinds of assessments where you're actually building continuously on the data that you collect in that one kind of survey, and thinking more creatively about how to include qualitative assessments and how to include kind of narrower surveys. And I think this is a space where I'm really interested to hear more from folks in this group about other ways that information has been collected from students across Connecticut's campuses. I really appreciate that this enabling legislation that gives us all our charge uses the word assessment rather than specifying a survey, because given the complexity of the topics that we're talking about and the complexity of our populations and of what it really means to make changes in policy and practice and climate, I think probably campuses are going to need to think well beyond a closed-ended survey instrument as part of how they meet their obligation to their students to really be learning continuously about what is happening on their campuses.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lily. And I will say that, again, having been involved in this legislation through the process, the word assessments was used very intentionally for that reason, to provide us with this level of flexibility. So short answer is yes, in statute, we do need to establish some sort of assessment and meet these tasks every 2 years. However, there is some flexibility as to what sort of assessment is used, and it does not need to be, nor necessarily should it be, right, such an expansive survey. Was there any other feedback or input that folks had in that regard? Is there any other questions or concerns that folks would like to have addressed while we are still sharing this space with one another? No? All right. Well, I suppose we were very productive and were able to sort of wrap up sooner than I anticipated, but I appreciate everyone's input and the way we were sort of able to organize as a group today. So I would like to look at the calendar as we have been meeting at noon on Tuesdays. I think I would like to keep to that just for a level of consistency, but feel free to weigh in if that is horrible idea for some reason. And that would actually put our February the 1st would land on a Tuesday. So that would potentially put us in a position where if we were to meet on January 18th or the 25th, we would be either 2 or 1 week out from the deadline that we had set. So that being said, does the 18th sound like a reasonable time frame before we reconvene, which would provide us with 2 weeks before the February 1st deadline? Any input? Lily?
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot.
No, everybody's providing really valuable input.
I was wondering if it would make sense to try to have maybe one working group meet on the 11th and one on the 18th, just to give a little bit more of a margin before February 1st.
Sure. I definitely like that idea. Any other input? I'm seeing head nods. Kara?
The 18th or really the 17th is the first day of classes at WCSU. So I would prefer to meet the week before, just in preparation of the beginning of the semester to give us a little more time. I'll be a little more available on the 11th if possible.
Sure. So perhaps we could have that first working group developing the data points and reviewing the tools. If that group wanted to plan to meet at noon on the 11th, then the second working group, just given that it's smaller, could plan to meet at the same time on the 18th. If anybody cannot make those meetings, you still absolutely can participate in the working group that you would like to, or the working groups that you'd like to, and provide input. And if there's a major conflict, I can, of course, readdress. But for now, like I said, just for the sake of consistency, we've been able to get a good number of folks available at these meetings. So I'd like to have that consistency for the time being. So at that point, we can address, but we did want to get the entire group together again before February the 1st. So did we want to attend to have a full council reconvene on the 25th? Is that too much to ask of everybody? That works? Okay. So just to review, we'll have the first working group regarding the data points and the tools meet on the 11th at noon. The second working group, who will be establishing the implementation guidelines, meet at noon on the 18th. Then on the 25th at noon, we will have the council reconvene to coordinate in preparation for our February 1st deadline. And then in regards to other deadlines, as I had shared, I can put together that report for everyone's review. Feel free, as I said, to review, place input, and then I can have that completed for January 1st. And then expect the email from me connecting all of you with one another, and look out as well for, I'll include the link again for the folder to our Google Drive, but within that Google Drive, I'll create 2 separate folders so that folks can begin to coordinate. And then in those folders, I'll have documents listing the tools so that you can sort of provide some feedback, for the different tools as you review them, as well as the legislation, so that you have on hand what you're tasked with based on your working group. So with that, I think our bases are pretty covered in terms of what our steps are going to look like moving forward. And I really, really appreciate everybody's participation in that discussion, because I think it puts me in a place where I feel really confident moving forward. as we plan ahead. Were there any other points for discussion? Anything else anybody wanted to add before we adjourn? All right, well, with the remaining 45 minutes, feel free to potentially review those tools if you have the time, or, something else related to our work here together. There's a lot to review, and I know it's been really helpful to look over it myself. But thank you all again for such a productive meeting. All of your, as always, incredibly valuable input. I am always available to each of you. So if there is any input in particular you'd like to provide, you can always reach out to me. And I would be happy to have a conversation with you, or coordinate via email, have a Zoom meeting, whatever is going to work best to ensure we get this work done and everybody's input is included. So with that, would somebody like to make a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Excellent. All right, everybody, please have happy and safe holidays. And I look forward to coordinating soon.